Thompsonville, and the bonds are still being paid even if the prison is sitting there empty because they don't have the operating funds to run it. The bond payments are still being made, the interest still has to be made, the bankers have taken their money and run off with it. And the taxpayers sit here, footing the bill for it. Some of the banks that have made a lot of money off this, Wells Fargo is a big one, but pretty much most of the banks have made a lot of money off it. Bond companies specialize in floating these bonds. Before they went under, Lehman Brothers was one of the big funders of prison bonds and for the private prison industry. And I was in New York City the day that Lehman Brothers collapsed, and I was giving a presentation at the bookstore in the East Village, and I started my presentation saying that I thought it was a great day that Lehman Brothers had collapsed, and I found out that in New York City you really shouldn't diss the finance industry. So that did not go over well. But we've got this huge amount of money, and when we think about the things that $1 trillion could have been spent on, that $1 trillion has been sunk into concrete and steel prisons and jails, and that's money that hasn't been made available for schools, for bridges, for infrastructure. That's a real policy choice that's been made. And the big thing is that, your children's future, our children's future, has been basically mortgaged off to the builders of prisons and jails. And when you think about the amount of money, the savings and loan collapse in the 1980s was around $650 billion, and the amount of money that's been spent on prisons and jails more than eclipses that. Another way, I'm going to touch briefly on private prisons, the private prison industry. That's a whole other topic on its own. But I'm just going to mention them in the case of the privatization of tax dollars and public wealth, is that tax dollars are being used to pay for the caging of people, which, when normally done by the government, doesn't really result in a recycling of tax dollars. So what we have here with the private prison industry, they take tax dollars, peel out a portion, which goes out as profit to their shareholders and the company executives that are running it, and then they also use it to launder some of the money back to the politicians that give them the contracts in the form of campaign donations to keep the whole cycle running again. And that's one of the differences with the government prisons, where at least with the government prisons, you don't have people actually making a profit off of incarceration directly. They just have to get it through their salaries rather than big bonuses. When we talk about the $1 trillion that have been spent to build new prisons and jails, most of those prisons and jails have been built in poor, rural white areas, largely populated in rural parts of the country, and it's been used as a tool of economic development as these towns are dying due to globalization and the deindustrialization of the United States. A lot of them have seen prisons as their salvation. And most of the prisoners come from urban centers far from these rural areas. And I think one of the things that's ironic is a lot of these new prisons have been built, and then they build these prisons and they find out that they can't staff them. Why? Well, they're in the middle of nowhere, and who wants to live in the middle of nowhere? So these are some of the ironies of mass incarceration. One of the things that we have in this country is, we've used prisons and mass incarceration as a solution to many other social problems. In this country, we may not have a public housing problem, and we may have a homelessness problem, but we have a prison solution to that. Governor Cuomo will go down in history as the brilliant governor who first figured out that he could use housing and urban development funds designated for low-income housing and use it to build prisons. And he used that money to build around 30,000 prison cells in upstate New York. And I guess the man should get a medal for being honest. It is indeed housing for the poor and for low-income people. We don't have a mental health policy. We don't have a policy or funds or resources to treat people with mental illness, and as a result, the statistics are that 40% of the people in prison or jail on any given day are seriously mentally ill. I think those numbers are grossly optimistic, and I think depends how serious mental illness is being defined. But our prisons are filled with the mentally ill. And I think that one of the things is we see the headlines about mass shootings around the country. One of the things that invariably comes up is the shooter was mentally ill. They had serious mental health problems, they didn't get any type of treatment, and typically they're dead, and so are a bunch of other people. And I think this is one of the promises of the police state, is that the police state promises security and doesn't deliver on it. Because you can say, hey, you're caging 2.5 million people, and you still can't protect us from mass shooters. So we've sacrificed vast amounts of liberty and freedom, and we're still not safe. Then we get into the effect of the political disenfranchisement effect of mass incarceration. I think everyone's familiar with the fact that in a lot of states, people that have been convicted of a felony can't vote. They're permanently disenfranchised. This is enough. The people that have been permanently disenfranchised, numbers anywhere depending on the, nationally at around 7 to 9 million people that can't vote. And that's enough that in many places, for example, in Florida during the 2000 election, where convicted felons are permanently disenfranchised, that would have probably been enough to sway that presidential election. Then we have the issue, too, of the other form of disenfranchisement is that people convicted of a felony can't own weapons, can't own firearms. And, you know, so we have the situation neither the ballot nor the bullet is, some would say. And this is in the context that the United States cranks out over 1 million, they mint 1 million new felons a year. So that's a lot of people that are being disenfranchised politically and otherwise. And for those who believe in the First Amendment and the Second Amendment, you know, that's something to think about. But beyond the political disenfranchisement of not being able to vote, as a convicted felon, I have the situation where I lived in Vermont for 10 years until recently, and prisoners in Vermont and Maine can still vote. Even if they're in prison, convicted felons can still vote. And the bigger problem that I have is I have no one to vote for. And yes, I think like Jim Hightower says, if the gods had wanted us to vote, he would have sent us candidates. But, you know, and I think this is one of the bigger problems is that, you know, I have a very minimalistic standard here. I mean, like, I just like to vote for someone who doesn't support the death penalty and doesn't believe in imperialist wars of aggression. You know, I mean, I'm not getting into crazy stuff like I want health care or I want a minimum wage or I think that I shouldn't have to work until I die. You know, nothing crazy like that, just a real minimalistic standard. And the reality is, you know, we don't have anyone to vote for. I mean, mass incarceration, everyone is down for it in the political mainstream in this country. There are no opponents to it. And, you know, even when you think about, oh, your favorite liberal politician, well, where do they stand on mass incarceration? Look at their voting record. Chances are they've voted for all of it. And I think one of the things that we have to remember, though, things weren't always this way. The prison population in this country was pretty stable between 1926 and 1980. During that time period, it was roughly around 300,000 people were locked up in the United States at any given time. Those numbers went down during wartime, like, for example, during World War II, the Korean War, and Vietnam, when young men were needed as cannon fodder to fight these imperial wars. And so, you know, they didn't need to be locked up. They could be sent off to shoot other people. So, but starting in the 1980s is when we start seeing mass incarceration really take off in this country. The other thing that changed during this time period is that before 1980, the American prison experience was mostly a white man's experience. Men of color were not locked up in very large numbers proportionate to the population. And when we talk about tools of social control, a lot of men of color were also lynched during that time period. So it's almost interesting when you see these lynchings decline in, I hate to use the term popularity, but at least frequency perhaps. The tool of social control of choice becomes incarceration. Women pretty much remain a footnote in mass incarceration at a given time. Women are around 5% of the prison population. They're locked up, of course, as the prison population has exploded, so has the number of women relative to that number. As far as our prisons and jails go, I mean, I think it's a fair statement to say that they're pretty much pits of brutality, despair, dehumanization, and medical neglect. But I think that one of the things that really sets the United States apart from other countries in the world is that a lot of money is spent on making them that way. And I think that when you go to other countries, I think if we were to go to a country like Venezuela, for example, they have the most violent prisons in the Western Hemisphere, anywhere between 500 and 900 prisoners in Venezuela out of a prison population of 40,000 are murdered each year, which is really off the hook. I think if we were to go to a country like Venezuela and talk to a prison warden there, they would say that, you know, well, hey, you know, we're doing the best we can, we have limited resources, we're a poor country, and, you know, this is the best we can do. But in the United States, you know, we don't have that excuse. We're a rich country. We spend a lot of money on this stuff. We spend between $80 and $90 billion a year to to lock up our 2.5 million people. And that's just the upfront operating costs.